Who's out there?
Please, I need a place to rest.
Come inside before the storm takes you. That mark, I've seen it before. My husband carried the same bullet.
He chased me for years. I didn't kill him, the storm did.
Then rest easy, stranger. The storm's over now.
You've got his courage.
The sun hung low over the frontier, bleeding its last light across the wide plains. The land was quiet in that hour before night, the kind of quiet that hummed inside a person's bones. Clara Hale stood by her porch rail, her apron stiff with the day's dust, watching how the dying sun caught the hills like they were on fire. The sky turned the color of copper coins, and the wind came carrying that dry scent of sage and earth, a scent that always reminded her of endings. The mule shifted in its pen, restless. Clara turned to it with a weary sigh. There wasn't much to tend anymore. The fields had gone yellow, the roof leaked when it rained, and her hands were cracked from pulling more weight than they were meant to. 2 years had passed since Henry, her husband, her anchor, her foolhardy lawman, hadn't come back from his last ride. The sheriff had ridden after an outlaw named Jesse Vane and never returned. The men brought his horse home without him, and Clara buried an empty box because that was all she had left. She was gathering the last of the laundry from the line when she saw movement out near the fence, something darker than the dust, stumbling like it had forgotten what legs were for. Her breath caught. Coyotes sometimes wandered close when the moon was thin, but this shape was taller, human. It staggered, caught the post for balance, then crumpled into the dirt. Clara dropped the basket. The clothespins scattered like pebbles as she hitched her skirts and ran. When she reached the figure, she found a man face down in the dry weeds, his coat torn, his shirt soaked through with blood that had dried to a dark rust. His horse was nowhere to be seen. He was breathing, but barely, a low rattle deep in his chest. She knelt beside him, brushed dust from his cheek. He wasn't old, not yet, but his face was carved by sun and years, and his jaw was rough with a few days' beard. "Sir," she called softly, her voice strange to her own ears. It had been too long since she'd spoken to anyone. He stirred, eyes flickering open just enough for her to see they were gray, clear, cutting, and unfocused. "Don't," his lips cracked as he spoke. "Don't take me to town." She frowned. "You'll die out here if I leave you." He gave a dry, humorless breath that might have been a laugh. "Maybe that's the point." Clara pressed a hand against the wound just below his ribs. The heat of his blood burned through her palm. "You need water. Help me get you to the barn." He tried to speak again, but his eyes rolled back, and he went limp. Clara stared at the horizon. Night was crawling fast, and the coyotes were already crying out somewhere beyond the ridge. She looked back at her small house, a single lantern glowing faintly inside, and then at the man in the dirt. She could walk away. She could tell herself she was done saving people who didn't belong to her. But she couldn't. "Lord, forgive me," she whispered. She hooked her arms under his shoulders and began to drag him. The earth tore at her boots, her breath rasping loud in her ears. Every few steps she had to stop, adjust her grip, and start again. The man was heavy, his boots leaving a long furrow in the dust behind them. By the time she reached the barn doors, her back ached and her heart hammered against her ribs. Inside, the air was thick with hay and horses' ghosts. She spread an old blanket on the straw and eased him down. The dim light showed the wound, a bullet hole low on his right side. Someone had tried to wrap it with a strip of cloth, but it was soaked through. Clara fetched a basin of water, her hands trembling as she wrung out a rag. She worked in silence, cleaning the dirt and blood away, whispering the kind of prayers she hadn't dared speak in years. When she pressed her fingers around the wound, his body flinched. "I know," she murmured. "I know it hurts." She poured whiskey over the torn flesh, biting her lip as he groaned. The smell of it filled the barn, sharp and burning. She threaded a needle, her eyes stinging from the lamplight and the ache of memory. Henry had always been the one to mend wounds, both man and beast. He used to say the land had enough death without them adding to it. Now it was her turn. By the time the stitches were done, the stranger's breathing had steadied, shallow but even. Clara leaned back against a beam, chest rising and falling with exhaustion. Her arms were slick with sweat. She took one last look at him under the faint glow of the lantern, his lashes dark against his cheeks, his lips pale, his chest barely lifting with each breath. He looked peaceful, almost like he belonged there. She stayed awake most of the night, listening. The wind rattled the barn boards. Once, she thought she heard boots on gravel and gripped the shotgun by the door, but it was only the shifting of the wood. Every so often, the man muttered something in his sleep, names maybe or half-formed apologies. Once, she caught a word that made her heart falter. "Cole," he breathed. "Don't," then silence. At dawn, she rose stiffly and stepped outside. The plains stretched pale and endless beneath the waking sun. The sky was a clear, merciless blue. She filled the bucket at the well, washed her face, and felt the old rhythm of survival press back into her bones. When she returned to the barn, the stranger was awake. Barely. His eyes tracked her movements, uncertain but aware. "You're still alive," she said quietly, setting down the bucket. He tried to smile, but it hurt too much. "So are you. You've lost blood. Don't move." "I won't," he muttered. "Promise." His voice had softened, rough but polite, like a man unused to gentleness. Clara dipped a cloth into the cool water and laid it against his forehead. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of peace cross his face. "Where were you headed?" she asked. He hesitated, eyes half open. "South. Long way from here." He gave a faint nod, then looked toward the sliver of light cutting through the barn wall. "What's your name?" "Clara." He seemed to roll the name on his tongue, as if testing it. "Thank you, Clara." She didn't answer. Gratitude was dangerous. It asked for something more. As the morning wore on, she went about her chores. She milked the mule for water, it was all she had left, and fed what grain she could spare to the chickens. The stranger slept most of the day, his breathing raspy but alive. Once, when she checked the wound, she noticed a thin chain around his neck, a small brass token hanging from it. The initials were worn but still clear, J.V. She frowned. Something about them itched at her memory. That night, as she sat by the fire in her small house, she pulled out the old wanted poster she kept folded in the drawer beneath Henry's Bible. She'd never been able to throw it away. The paper was yellowed now, edges brittle, the ink faded. But the name was still legible enough to read. Jesse Vane. Wanted dead or alive. $500 reward. She read the description: gray eyes, scar near the jaw, early 30s. Dangerous. Known to ride under Cole Mercer. Clara's hands went still. She glanced toward the window, where the barn stood under the pale moonlight. A shiver ran through her. The man lying on her barn floor wasn't just a wounded stranger. The wind howled across the prairie that night, rattling the loose boards of the barn and whistling through every crack like the voice of the dead. Inside, the lantern's light wavered against the walls, casting shadows that seemed to breathe with the wounded man's uneven pulse. Clara sat beside him, her hand wrapped around a damp cloth, dabbing sweat from his brow as his fever burned through another hour. His skin was pale beneath the grime, lips cracked, jaw tight with dreams that didn't let him rest. She had seen fever before, Henry's, when the wound wouldn't close, when the doctor's wagon was too late. But this one fought harder. The man muttered as he dreamed, whispering names she didn't recognize. Cole, Annie, Dust Creek, and every few moments, he gasped like he'd been struck. She didn't ask what ghosts chased him, she only pressed the cloth to his head and prayed under her breath for them to pass by. By morning, the fever broke, leaving him shivering and silent. Clara pulled the blanket higher, fed him spoonfuls of broth when he stirred, and changed the dressing on his wound. The blood had slowed, the stitches held. He was still a long way from walking, but he might live. The thought both comforted and frightened her. The next afternoon, when she came in with the water bucket, she found his eyes open. They were clearer than before, gray as winter sky, and for a long moment, he simply watched her. It wasn't the look of a man waking in a stranger's care. It was the look of someone unsure whether to thank her or apologize for existing. "You're awake," she said, voice soft, cautious. His lips twitched into something close to a smile. "Seems I am." "How's the pain?" "Depends," he rasped. "You talking about the kind in my side or the rest of me?" Clara didn't answer. She dipped the rag in cool water and handed it to him. He wiped his mouth, wincing as his body protested even that small motion. "You stitched me," he murmured after a pause. "Could have left me for the coyotes." "I've done that before," she said evenly, "but only for men who deserved it." His gaze flickered toward her, testing, then softened. "Guess I should be grateful you couldn't tell which I was." She said nothing, only turned back to the kettle. The smell of stew hung in the air, thin but warm, and she ladled some into a tin bowl. He ate slowly, careful with each bite, like a man who hadn't known kindness in too long. The days that followed bled together into a rhythm. Clara fetched water from the well each dawn, checked the wound, cooked, and fed the animals. The stranger, he still called himself Will, tried to help when he could. By the 5th day, he could stand with effort, and he spent hours sitting near the open barn doors, letting the sun wash over his face. He didn't speak much. When he did, it was mostly in small phrases about the land or the weather. "Dry country," he said once, watching the wind stir dust over the fields. "It always was," Clara replied. "Why stay?" "Because leaving doesn't bring back what's gone." He didn't ask again. At night, she could hear him from the house, shifting in the hay, breathing heavy, caught in dreams. Twice she'd woken to his voice calling names again, his tone cracked with regret. Each time she'd light a lamp and walk to the barn, standing by his side until he settled. He never opened his eyes, never saw her there, but when his breathing calmed, she always returned to bed with her own heart restless. Something in him pulled at her in ways she didn't want to name. It wasn't pity, it was recognition, the shape of a brokenness that matched her own. He carried it in his shoulders, in the way he flinched at sudden noises, in the way he never asked for forgiveness but wore it in silence. One evening, the light outside had turned to amber, stretching the shadows long. Clara was mending a torn sleeve by the fire when he came to the door, leaning against the frame. He'd shaved, cleaned up a bit, and though still pale, there was strength back in his eyes. "You shouldn't be walking so soon," she said, not looking up from her sewing. "Can't lay there forever," he answered. "Besides, I wanted to thank you proper." She tied off the thread. "Words don't fix what's broken, mister." "No," he said quietly. "But they can start to." She looked at him then, at the faint scar on his jaw and the way the firelight traced his face. Something about that light reminded her too much of Henry, the same weary gentleness that men found only after they'd bled for it. "You can thank me by healing," she said. "And by not bringing trouble here." He nodded. "Trouble's been riding behind me a long time. I'll do my best to lose it." She didn't ask what that meant. She didn't have to. Men like him didn't come out of the desert by accident. Later, after he'd gone back to the barn, Clara stayed by the fire, staring at the glowing embers. She didn't know if it was foolishness or faith that kept her from questioning him. Perhaps both. But as the night deepened, an unease began to crawl under her skin. A feeling that there was something more to him than he let on. The next morning, she found the proof. She was washing his clothes by the trough when she noticed the weight in his coat pocket. Thinking it might be a flask or knife, she reached in, and froze. Her fingers brushed cold metal. She drew it out slowly. It was a revolver. Heavy, well-oiled, and old. She turned it over in her hand, the sunlight catching on a faint engraving along the grip. The letters, though worn, were clear enough to read. Jesse Vane. Her throat went dry. For a long moment, the world seemed to narrow, the wind, the rustling grass, the sound of her own heartbeat, all folding into silence. That name had lived like a ghost in her house for 2 years, whispered in her husband's dying breath and carved into the wanted posters that yellowed on the sheriff's walls. Jesse Vane. The outlaw Henry Hale had chased into the desert and never come back from. She looked toward the barn. Through the open door, she saw him sitting where the light spilled across the floorboards, his shoulders bowed as if weighed by something heavier than pain. Clara slipped the gun back into the coat and stepped away, her pulse trembling through her hands. She tried to breathe, tried to remember the sound of Henry's voice, the look on his face when he'd said, "If I don't return, you keep your head high. Don't ever let the past own you." But the past was already here, alive, wounded, resting under her roof. That night, she could barely bring herself to light the lamps. He sat quietly at the table, eating in slow bites, unaware of what she'd found. Every time his eyes met hers, she saw 2 men instead of one, the stranger before her and the ghost of the one who'd killed her peace. "You're awful quiet tonight," he said, setting down his spoon. "Just tired," she replied. "Been a long day." "Too long for some," he murmured, leaning back with a small sigh. "Sometimes I wonder how many more I'll get." She looked at him then, really looked. Beneath the calm voice, she saw the exhaustion, the guilt, the shadow of something he didn't dare speak. A part of her wanted to demand the truth right there, to drag it out into the open and watch it burn. But another part, the part that still believed in mercy, held her still. When the dishes were cleared, she handed him a fresh bandage for his wound. He thanked her softly, their fingers brushing for an instant. The touch startled them both.